The film world is engulfed in grief as Robert Redford, a timeless Hollywood icon, concludes his extraordinary journey at 89 on September 16, 2025. Within the quiet of his Utah home, the man who defined an era took his final breath, leaving deep sorrow for his family and countless devoted fans. For over 6 decades, he was not just a face on screen, but a force who elevated the art of cinema itself, winning an Academy Award with Ordinary People, founding Sundance as a sanctuary for filmmakers, and etching a chapter into world culture that will never fade. He gave audiences unforgettable performances, rare elegance, and a nostalgic longing for a vanished golden age. Yet behind the glow lay a soul scarred by tragedy, the death of his firstborn son, the heartrending losses, the wounds that never closed. Time proved unforgiving, and fate has now struck its harshest blow, taking from us a man who carried both beauty and pain, who endured loss with quiet dignity, and who transformed suffering into work that touched the deepest corners of the human heart. This is not merely the passing of Robert Redford, but the collapse of a monument, the extinguishing of a flame that lit generations, the silence of a voice that once thundered against injustice and whispered of love, loss, and resilience. What has happened is not just another sad chapter, but a shattering truth, a cruel blow upon humanity's heart, leaving millions breathless with grief. Before we begin this journey, press the like button as a tribute to a legend who gave everything to the world, and now leaves behind a silence more resounding than fame. To the world, Robert Redford blazed as a golden Hollywood icon, yet in his fragile youth he lay confined to a narrow bed, his small body paralyzed by polio, his young spirit dragged into shadows no audience would ever see shadows, pressing like a silent verdict, as if fate were already testing how much pain a legend's heart could bear. Born August 18, 1936, in Santa Monica to Charles and Martha, raised as an only child in Van Nuys with modest means under the lingering shadow of the Depression, he learned far too early how fragile life could be. Around 1946, at just 10, he felt the sting of disinfectant, the suffocating weight of blankets heavier than bone, the terror of willing a limb to move when it refused. He later recalled, "I thought I might never walk again, but my mother refused to let me give up." Night after night, Martha massaged his stiff legs, whispering hope into rooms where silence pressed like stone, teaching him that resilience sometimes arises not in triumph, but in the quiet refusal to surrender. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the boy who would one day command the screen first had to command his fear. Restless and angry, he drifted into a rough Los Angeles crowd, slipping into reckless nights carrying risks he didn't grasp. "I was always searching for something I couldn't name," he admitted years later. One night police stopped him for mischief and careless behavior, ending only with a warning but leaving an unforgettable message, a realization of how close he'd come to losing everything, and how his father's steady hand pulled him back from an edge that might have ruined his life. To keep from slipping again, he escaped into sketchbooks filled with imagined lives, the open sky promising horizons, and the rhythm of sport that steadied his restless heart. With a racket he proved his worth, even warming up tennis legend Pancho Gonzalez at the Los Angeles Tennis Club, a fleeting spark telling him he might belong somewhere beyond the forgotten corners of a restless city. Yet fate was not finished. In 1955, at 18, came the cruelest blow. His mother, the very woman who had massaged life back into his paralyzed legs, entered surgery and never returned. What began as hope ended in infection, extinguishing the light of his world. For the only son she left, the loss was absolute, deeper than illness. His father never remarried, and their house became a hollow shell echoing with her absence. Redford would look back on that year as the moment the ground gave way, boyhood's fragile scaffolding collapsing. "It left me with a silence I could never fill," he said, a silence that trailed him into adulthood, into fame, into triumphs that should have felt like victories, but instead carried the shadow of a wound no success could heal. The mid-1950s brought extremes that cut like blades. A sports scholarship to the University of Colorado made him feel 20 feet tall, but heavy drinking soon stripped it away. The shame of packing up the earliest stone he carried as if the world had slammed a door before he'd even learned to open it. At the brink of despair, he chose exile over surrender. In his early 20s, he wandered France, Spain, and Italy, living simply, painting, sketching, walking endless miles under foreign skies until the noise inside him softened. Years later, he would admit, resilience is rarely loud. It is moving forward anyway, when fear has every argument in its favor. Returning to New York in his mid-20s, carrying scars and tools, he brought a stubborn belief in art, a discipline forged on chords and trails, and a vow carved in silence that when shadows came again, he would not surrender, but meet them with work. This crucible became the foundation of the legend we mourn today, not a smooth origin myth, but a painfully real childhood, a body nearly stolen by disease, a heart cruelly rearranged by grief, missteps that almost ended his story too soon, and an awakening earned the hard way through exile, struggle, and the lonely determination to begin again. To outsiders, his return to New York in the late 1950s might have looked like a young man chasing ambition, but in truth it was the desperate gamble of someone already scarred by illness, grief, and humiliation wounds that could have destroyed him, but instead hardened his will into steel. At just 22, with his mother's death still raw and the shame of a lost scholarship burning, he walked those narrow city streets beneath flickering neon and wet pavement, not with youthful certainty, but the heavy burden of survival. He studied painting at Pratt Institute, clutching brushes and canvases as lifelines, and then, daring himself not to retreat, enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Acting was no revelation, no instant triumph, only another brutal climb. At 24, he scraped by on small television roles The Twilight Zone, Maverick, Perry Mason jobs so meager they barely paid the rent. Yet each line he delivered proved he had not surrendered. Years later, he would look back with unvarnished honesty. It was not glamour, not even close. It was pure survival, yet even survival carried its irony, because the very face the world would later revere was at first his greatest obstacle. Casting directors stared at his golden hair and perfect symmetry, and dismissed him as too pretty for depth, too polished to be believable. The boy who had once fought to be seen as more than frail or reckless now faced a new invisible battle, to be recognized as more than a face. It was a gilded cage he was inside, but no one thought he belonged, as he later confessed with lingering bitterness. His looks opened doors only for them to slam shut again, trapping the artist in a cruel cage of beauty. Then came 1963, when everything shifted. On Broadway, in Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park, Redford was cast as the young husband opposite Elizabeth Ashley, and at 27, he finally stood on a stage where he could reveal what burned beneath the surface. Night after night, he gave audiences wit, timing, and quiet vulnerability critics could not ignore. The play became a sensation that ran for years. For him, it was more than a triumph, it was liberation. For the first time, they saw me, not just what I looked like, he reflected. In the roar of the audience was not merely applause, but vindication, the delayed acknowledgement that he was more than a handsome face. From Broadway, the screen inevitably followed. Hollywood called and Redford moved into films. First small parts and then leading roles, revealing the force he was becoming. Yet even as his career gained speed, the sting of early dismissals never faded. That wow became the hidden engine of his choices, planting in him the need for independence and the fire to step behind the camera, to seize control of stories so no one could ever mistake him for a shallow owl again. Looking back now, knowing he has left us, the irony feels poetic. The man who would redefine American cinema and carve out new space for independent voices. Through Sundance began his ascent, battling the cruelest misjudgment that talent could be reduced to symmetry. It was in those years, from dim television sets to the burning light of Broadway, that Redford's resilience took root. He proved himself not a mask, but a man, not an image, but an artist who clawed for every inch. Broadway was only the beginning. Waiting in the wings were films that would ignite his stardom, carry his name across continents, and etch him forever into the memory of generations. What began as a fragile climb erupted into a meteoric rise, and now as the world mourns him, it feels like destiny written in blood and fire. Redford's rise to Hollywood summit shimmered with golden light, yet beneath that radiance lay invisible wounds, private battles woven into his fame. Through the late 1960s and 1970s, he looked untouchable, one of the most bankable stars on the planet, carving unforgettable portraits that defined an era. The Sundance Kid in Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid, the sly and brilliant Johnny Hooker in The Sting, the resolute journalist Bob Woodward in All the President's Men, the romantic partner to Barbra Streisand and In the Way We Were. These roles alone could have secured immortality. Yet for Redford, every ovation carried a hidden weight. Every burst of applause was shadowed by the chains of beauty, fame, and expectation that tightened even as the world cheered. He admitted that the very face millions adored was never a blessing without a curse. Casting directors once dismissed him outright as too pretty, and even at the height of success, he felt the sting of suspicion. Was he truly more than a poster? More than golden hair and symmetry? It can be a gilded cage. You are inside, but no one thinks you belong, he confessed, his voice edged with the bitterness of a man who had fought for recognition all his life. Even in triumph, applause sometimes echoed with doubt, forcing him to prove again and again he was not a hollow idol, but an artist of substance, heart, and conviction. That paradox became the thread of his career, the image that opened doors, also threatened to erase him, a cruel contradiction he carried like a hidden weight. When The Great Gatsby failed to ignite audiences despite his presence, the disappointment cut deeper than reviews. To the public, it was a misstep. To Redford, a brutal reminder of the merciless weight of expectation. The cruel truth that a so-called golden boy was not allowed to falter even once. Yet instead of retreating, he pressed into riskier, heavier work, pouring himself into projects like All the President's Men, where film bowed not to escape, but to urgency, where entertainment was sacrificed to truth. The process was grueling, filled with accusations. He was too self-serious, haunted by the risk of alienating those who came for laughter, while he delivered confrontation. But Redford never bent. Cinema has a duty to mirror reality, however uncomfortable, he declared, bearing the loneliness of that conviction like a soldier carrying unseen scars. Then came the crucible that tested him more than any role. Stepping behind the camera for ordinary people, the industry whispered that a handsome leading man could never summon the vision or discipline of a true director, and every day on set felt like walking a tightrope under the gaze of doubters, waiting for him to stumble. Yet what emerged was triumph, a piercing, intimate film that tore open the silence of grief and earned him the Academy Award for Best Director. For Redford, the Oscar was more than recognition. It was vindication, a release from years of suspicion, a declaration that he belonged not only in front of the camera, but behind it as a master storyteller. Still, his hunger reached further. In 1981, he planted what would become the beating heart of independent cinema, Sundance. What the world now reveres as a sanctuary for dreamers began as a fragile vision, ridiculed by skeptics, starved for funding, kept alive only by his own resources and unshakable faith. Friends warned he was risking too much. Nights came when collapse seemed inevitable, but he carried it forward not for himself, but for others. To give the stage he once struggled to claim and create a haven where raw, unpolished voices could finally be heard. He sacrificed peace, fortune, even companionship, enduring the solitude of a man who refuses the easy road so others may walk the harder path with hope. Thus the brilliance of Robert Redford's golden age was never simple shine, a brilliance edged with pain, the weight of beauty that felt like a prison, the crushing sting of expectation, the exhaustion of proving himself again and again, and the endless strain of nurturing a fragile dream into a sanctuary. The world saw the triumph. Redford lived the struggle, and it was in that struggle his legend was forged, not as a man who merely basked in fame, but one who carried his shadows, wrestled with them, and turned them into something enduring. Today, as we mourn his passing, the truth resounds clearer than ever. The world remembers a star, but what endures is the artist who proved that even at the summit the climb is never free of pain, and that greatness is born not from ease, but from fire. To the world, Robert Redford's life shimmered like a Hollywood fairy tale. Yet behind the dazzling premieres and thunderous applause, unfolded a far more intimate story, one of love found young, fragile beginnings, and a man who believed he had finally secured a sanctuary no storm could breach. In 1958, at just 22 and still a stranger to fame, he married Lola Van Wagenen, a woman of quiet brilliance and steadfast grace who became not only his partner, but his refuge. Their early days were stripped of glamour, borrowed furniture filling sparse rooms, nights spent stretching a few dollars, whispered promises under dim lights that love alone would be their wealth. For Redford, who had known illness, loss, and uncertainty, those first years with Lola were a revelation. In her presence, the chaos of the outside world seemed to still, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe in permanence, in the simple miracle of a family taking root. What they built together was not the Hollywood dream others imagined, but something rarer and more sacred, a fragile haven of devotion and defiance. A vow that whatever storms lay ahead, they would face hand in hand. The first storm arrived with a cruelty neither could have imagined. Swift and merciless, their firstborn Scott lived for only a few weeks, and with his passing the fragile sanctuary they had built cracked under a grief too vast for words. The nursery they had painted with trembling anticipation filled with tiny clothes and dreams of lullabies, collapsed into a suffocating silence that burrowed into their souls. Lola, once a wellspring of quiet strength, was left with arms aching to cradle a child who was no longer there. Each glance at the empty crib of fresh wound that refused to close. Redford too was broken, carrying the unbearable knowledge that no measure of love or success could ever rewrite those vanished days. And years later he would whisper that you never heal from something like that. You just learned to live around it, though the truth was harsher. The loss did not surround him. It lived within him, shaping the silent mornings that felt hollow, the forced smiles that faltered before reaching his eyes, and the unspoken shadow that sat between husband and wife at the quietest hours of night. To the world, he would become the Sundance Kid, a man who seemed untouchable. But to himself and to Lola, he was forever a father and mother scarred by the ghost of a son, taken too soon. Their love carrying not only devotion, but the unbearable weight of absence. When James Jaime arrived, hope returned to their home like a fragile flame trembling against the wind. But it was a light forever stalked by shadows. Born too soon, his body delicate and unprepared for the world, every breath he took was a battle. Every day a victory carved from suffering. Hospital corridors replaced playgrounds. Sterile machines and their relentless beeping became the lullabies of his childhood. And medical charts filled with ominous numbers became a language his parents had no choice but to master. Jaime endured it all, endless treatments, multiple surgeries, to liver transplants, and with each fragile recovery, it was as though he borrowed strength, not only from his own will, but from the hearts of those who loved him. For Robert Redford, the double life was merciless. By day, beneath the blinding lights of Hollywood, he carried the image of control and charm the world demanded. By night, he sat in dim hospital rooms, gripping the small hand of his son and whispering promises he knew he might never keep. Scripts traveled with him into waiting rooms. Dialogue rehearsed in silence while his own heart thundered with dread. And he once admitted to a friend that it was like living under skies that never cleared, never knowing when the storm would break. And the storm did break. In 2020, after decades of unimaginable resilience, Jaime's long fight ended with cancer of the bile ducts at 58. For Redford, by then a frail old man himself, the loss was unbearable. Not just as a father, but as a man condemned to live through fate's cruel symmetry. The echo of Scott's death in infancy reverberating across the decades, as if the universe had circled back to reopen a wound that had never truly closed. Two sons taken in different ways, but leaving the same devastating silence, became the unshakable shadow haunting every triumph of his life. To the world, Robert Redford was a legend immortalized on screen, but to himself, he was a father twice broken, condemned to carry a sorrow so vast that no award, no ovation, no standing applause could ever touch it. His fame gilded him in light, but behind that glow lived a grief darker and heavier than the world could ever know. Through every heartbreak and every storm, Lola remained by his side, their marriage stretching nearly 3 decades, carrying them from the anonymity of their hungry youth into the merciless blaze of global fame. She was the quiet shield who protected Dare for Children from Hollywood's chaos, while he disappeared into faraway sets, chasing roles, chasing purpose, chasing an identity larger than himself. Together they bore distance, gossip, and the crushing weight of a public image that left little space for private peace. Yet time, merciless and unyielding, eroded even the strongest foundations. In 1985, after 27 years, the inevitable fracture came. No scandal, no betrayal, no shouting, only silence, sorrow, and the hollow recognition that the people who had once clung to each other like lifelines had slowly drifted into separate worlds. For Redford, the end was not just the loss of a marriage, but the shattering of the only sanctuary he had ever known. He never spoke of Lola with bitterness. Instead, he carried her memory with reverence, often calling her the great love of his life, the woman who steadied him when he was still unproven, the partner who endured his absences and bore his heaviest burdens long before the applause and the accolades. Yet beneath that gratitude lived the grief. You ever saw the grief of a man who realized too late that love alone cannot always withstand the weight of time, ambition, and distance? For all his triumphs, the collapse of that bond was a wound as profound as any loss he ever suffered. To the world, Robert Redford stood tall as a legend, but in the quiet of his heart, he remained a man marked by the ache of knowing that even the greatest love of his life could not survive the storms that shaped him. What makes this chapter of Robert Redford's life so searing is not merely the tally of losses, But the cruel contrast between image and reality, the world saw him stride across screens. With effortless charm, outwit villains as Johnny Hooker, command truth as Bob Woodward, or lift an Oscar for Ordinary People. Yet the man behind those roles walked into homes where silence weighed heavier than applause. He lived existences at once, one bathed in camera lights, another dimmed by hospital lamps. The public adored a legend. His family knew a father whispering encouragement to a fragile child, a husband quietly holding together a marriage strained by distance and grief. From those private torments emerged a strength no critic could measure. His films resonated because they were born of contradiction, joy and despair, victory and loss, light and shadow, and his performances carried grace because he had lived moments where grace seemed impossible. Redford embodied resilience not as an easy slogan, but as a relentless choice to rise, to endure, to create, even when everything seemed to collapse beneath him. His marriage to Lola, their decades of devotion and fracture, the shattering loss of Scott, the long fight and final farewell to Jaime, the parting of two people. Who once believed love could conquer all these are not side notes to his career, but the crucible of his humanity. The applause will always belong to Hollywood, but the silences, the ones steeped in grief, dignity, and endurance, belong to Robert Redford the man. And now with his passing, it is within those silences, as much as in the ovations, that his truest legacy resides. In the years after his marriage ended, Robert Redford did not drift carelessly through the romances that tabloids imagined. He moved cautiously, testing whether his heart fractured by loss and time could still risk trust. There were moments of warmth that glowed briefly, each carrying its own truth, with Sonia Bra, whose fire and artistry matched his restless energy. There was admiration and a fleeting joy of two creators colliding, and with Lena Olin, during the filming of Havana in 1990, the chemistry was so undeniable. It seemed destined for more, yet reality proved harsher than the promise of a script. There were others like costume designer Kathy Orr, who stood quietly beside him, a gentle anchor when the machinery of fame felt crushing. And these connections were not failures, but fragile bridges, small attempts to cross the distance between who he had been and who he was struggling to become. Yet none endured, and each ending left a bruise. Reopening the wound of a marriage he still carried like an unhealed scar. He admitted privately that he always wanted love to steady him, but also knew too well how devastating it is when it disappears. Jane Fonda, who knew him over decades, offered the most piercing glimpse, saying he could draw you close, but always held something back as if guarding a door no one else could enter, a distance born not of indifference, but of survival. Redford had lived through what most hearts could not: the death of an infant son, the long illness and eventual loss of another, and the collapse of the love that had once defined his youth, and to emerge from those storms was to learn the merciless truth that love is both salvation and devastation, and to reach for it is to risk being broken again. Yet he never stopped reaching. Behind the immaculate image of the Hollywood legend was not a man chasing conquest, but a man chasing resonance, yearning for someone who could share not the glamour of premieres, but the silence of night. And sometimes he found it for a season, sometimes only for a fleeting moment, each departure leaving him with sorrow, but also insight. What remained was not scandal, but the ache of almost brief flames that warmed before fading into embers, and if his first marriage was the foundation of his youth, these later loves were brushstrokes, imperfect, incomplete, but real, revealing Redford not as an untouchable icon, but as a man scarred yet still open, carrying grief yet refusing to let loss have the last word, even in solitude until his final days, still a believer in love, knowing full well it could wound, but holding on to the fragile, unyielding hope that it might also heal. To speak of Robert Redford's life is to speak not only of his roles and triumphs, but of the rare souls who walked beside him, leaving imprints deeper than fame itself. Among them none marking him more profoundly than Natalie Wood and Paul Newman, to companions who entered at different chapters yet whose departures carved voids no ovation could ever fill. Natalie appeared in his orbit in the early 1960s when both were still young actors, stumbling into Hollywood's merciless glare. They worked together on Inside Daisy Clover, and This Property is Condemned. And what began as professional partnership quickly grew into a sibling-like trust, to fragile spirits holding on to each other in an industry that judged without mercy. Redford would later recall how her kindness steadied him in those uncertain years, and how she encouraged him when he faltered in the terrifying leap from stage to screen. She carried a delicate blend of vulnerability and steel that he never forgot. And then, in 1981, at the height of his fame, came the call. That shattered him. Natalie had drowned at just 43. Her life ending suddenly in waters that left more questions than answers. To the world, it was a headline. To Redford, it was the brutal silence of a voice he had leaned on. The hollow where a friend's laughter once lived. He spoke little of her passing, but those who knew him understood the shadow it cast. A cruel reminder that even the brightest lights can vanish in an instant. And in memory, she remained radiant, forever young and yet forever absent. If Natalie's loss was a sudden wound, Paul Newman's passing decades later was a slower, heavier cut that time only deepened. From the day they joined forces in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, their chemistry set the screen ablaze, but off-screen it gave birth to something rare: brotherhood. They raced cars, played practical jokes, swapped confidences over quiet drinks, and shared laughter that pierced even the darkest days. For Redford, Newman was not just a colleague, but the anchor who understood the peculiar loneliness of fame. Without a single word, their bond deepening with countless unseen moments no audience would ever witness. But time was merciless again. Newman's boundless vitality dimmed under the grip of lung cancer, and Redford, visiting when he could, watched helplessly as a piece of his own life slipped away. And when Newman died in 2008 at 83, Redford, then 72, summed it up with words stripped to their core: "There's a hole in my life now." Not a crafted statement for the press, but the raw confession of a man mourning the brother he had chosen. To lose Natalie in midlife and Newman in later years was to feel grief into devastating shades. First, the shock of a dazzling flame extinguished too soon. Then the long agony of watching time and illness slowly claim what once seemed unshakable. Both losses reminding Redford of the truth no legend could escape, that even the great are mortal and no applause can shield the heart from absence. Yet amid the silence they left, he carried gratitude. For Natalie's kindness when he was unsteady, and for Newman's laughter that steadied him through storms. Behind the myth of the Sundance Kid was a man who in his final years lived in a theater of memory, applauding ghosts who would never return to the stage. And while the world will forever celebrate his films, Robert Redford carried until his last breath the faces of those he loved, the light they brought, and the empty chairs they left when the curtain fell too soon. His story, long illuminated by the glare of triumph and shadowed by grief, softened into a more fragile, more human light in the late 1990s when he met Sybil Sagers, a German-born artist whose life was measured not in scripts or premieres, but in colors, brushstrokes, and the elemental patience of nature. Where Hollywood demanded noise, Sybil offered silence. Where the past had left scars, she created space. And for Redford, meeting her was like watching rain fall across a desert, unexpected, tender, and impossible to turn away from. He would later confide to friends that with her he felt for the first time in decades that the ground beneath him could breathe again. Their love was not born of the fever of youth, but of the steady rhythm of two souls who had already weathered storms and no longer needed to rush. With Sybil, he was not Robert Redford the star, nor the legend, nor the public idol, but simply a man weathered by loss yet no longer crushed by it. And by the time they married in 2009 at 73, Redford described it in words stripped of glamour, but heavy with truth. It feels like a new life. Behind that simple statement lying a lifetime of searching, and aching for the peace that had eluded him for so long. Together they wove not only love, but a calling. From their home in Santa Fe under vast skies that could hold both silence and sudden rain, they created The Way of the Rain, a work that was part art, part prayer. Sybil painted with light and movement while Redford lent his voice steady, engraved the stories of the earth's fragile beauty and looming peril. To audiences it was art, to them it was devotion. In those evenings, as images of water rippled across the stage and music rose like wind in the desert, Redford was not performing. He was speaking from his soul beside the woman who had become both his partner and his sanctuary. This final chapter of his life carried a gentleness absent from all the ones before. No longer the young husband counting borrowed dollars in 1958. No longer the broken father at a child's hospital bed. No longer the friend staring at empty chairs where laughter once lived. He was now a man who had walked through deserts of grief and finally found the sound of rain. Sybil did not ask him to prove himself nor to carry the weight of legend. With her, love was not survival, it was stillness, a chance to breathe. Healing, he discovered at last, was not the absence of wounds, but the presence of grace. The scars remained, yet with her he learned to carry them, as though softened by water, worn smooth by time, no longer sharp enough to cut. In Sybil's presence, Robert Redford found what he had been denied for most of his life: a quiet harbor, a hand that steadied without demand, a love that healed without condition. And then the curtain fell. In his final years, Robert Redford's stride, once vigorous enough to conquer mountains, and film set slowed into measured steps. His voice, once carrying conviction across theaters, softened into a fragile murmur. Yet his mind remained sharp, tethered always to the earth and to Sybil, the woman who had brought him rain after decades of drought. Behind closed doors, he carried the scars of illness and the exhaustion of years spent defying time itself, enduring it all with the quiet dignity that had defined him since boyhood. And then came September 16, 2025, in the stillness of his home in Sundance, Utah, where the high desert sky stretched endlessly above and the silence of nature surrounded him. He exhaled one last time. His departure was not marked by fanfare, but by the hush of inevitability. A single breath that closed the final act of a life that had fought storms, carried losses, and still insisted on hope. To the world, it was the end of an era. To his family, it was the collapse of their very center, the sudden implosion of the fragile peace they had woven around him. For Sybil, the pain was devastation beyond language. She had been his anchor, his partner in both art and silence, the hand that steadied his storms. Now their house, once filled with paintings, music, and whispered prayers, for the earth rang hollow with absence. Where his voice had narrated her art, there was only the roar of silence. Where his hands had held hers, there was only emptiness. His children, Shauna, Amy, and Dylan, and his grandchildren wept not for an icon, but for the father and grandfather who had been their scarred but steady presence. Grief became mercilessly tangible: the vacant chair at the dinner table, the garden where his laughter no longer rose with the wind, the conversations that would remain suspended forever in air. His passing reopened every wound that had already marked their lives: the fragile breath of Scott, gone in infancy. The decades of Jaime's suffering ended only in 2020. The echoes of friends like Natalie Wood and Paul Newman, whose absences had already hollowed him out, now it was his family who bore the silence. A silence heavier and sharper than any ovation could conceal. When the announcement reached the world, headlines roared of the fall of a titan. Tributes poured in, directors, actors, presidents, fans, all racing to name his greatness. But in the quiet of Utah morning was intimate, unphotographed. Sybil clutched the keepsakes that still held his touch: a scarf carrying his scent, a sketch he had abandoned midline, the chair by the window that would never again bear his weight. His children wept as those who had already learned too much about loss, their grief not gilded with myth but raw with absence. For them, every room in that house now echoed with him and without him, a paradox too painful to reconcile. And yet as they must, they will carry it forward just as he once did, honoring him not in the glare of premieres, but in the quiet rituals of memory, in the storm that recalls his resilience, in the rainfall that whispers of healing, in the silence that cradles his lessons. For Robert Redford's true greatness was never the shine of Hollywood, but the entrance of the human heart, and in the hearts of those who loved him most, his absence will forever remain the most enduring presence. There are legends whose names shine brightly, and then there are legends whose very lives become a compass for generations. Robert Redford was not only the face of Hollywood's golden age, he was its conscience, its restless spirit, its living reminder that behind every light lies shadow, and behind every triumph lies sacrifice. To speak of him is to speak not merely of cinema or accolades, but of a man who turned wounds into wisdom, who carried storms in silence, and who transformed private pain into stories that echoed across the world. The world will always remember the Sundance Kid, the slight brilliance of the sting, the urgent voice of all the president's men, the quiet authority of ordinary people. Yet his greatest performance was never under the camera's eye. It was the way he bore grief without letting it consume him, carried beauty without being blinded by it, and held fame without ever surrendering his integrity. For decades, audiences adored his face, but those who looked closer discovered something far rarer: honesty. He built his career not on vanity, but on depth, on courage, on the insistence that art mattered because truth mattered. And when he stepped behind the camera, he revealed not just vision, but bravery, the willingness to tell stories of fractured silence and survival, stories that mirrored the scars he himself carried. But Redford's legacy cannot be measured in film reels alone. His greatest monument was Sundance, the fragile dream he birthed in 1981, that blossomed into a global sanctuary for voices the mainstream might have silenced. It was never about himself, it was about the artists he lifted the sparks. He refused to let die the countless filmmakers whose first breath of recognition came because he once dared to fight for them. This was his genius. He never built shrines to his own name, but platforms for others. He believed that art was not vanity, but a covenant between humanity and truth. Even in his later years, he continued to nurture Sundance with the tenderness of a gardener, even as he confessed his fear that his soul might one day be swallowed by commerce. He knew it was a flame to be guarded, and he guarded it until his last breath. At the time of his passing, Redford's earthly wealth was estimated at nearly $200 million, earned not only from decades of unforgettable performances, but from directing, producing, and the careful stewardship of his beloved Utah estate once tied to Sundance. Yet for all the numbers, he never flaunted his fortune. What mattered to him was balance, the narrowing of life's circle to art, nature, and family. And even as his health declined, projects still lingered on his desk unfinished. Sketches, environmental campaigns, and narratives he longed to bring to light those who knew him best said he left this world with work still glowing inside him, the eternal condition of an artist who never stopped searching, never stopped giving. Robert Redford's story resonates because it was not perfect, it was human. He endured losses that could have broken anyone, 2 sons taken in different decades, friends like Natalie Wood and Paul Newman gone too soon, a marriage that unraveled under the weight of fame, yet he never surrendered. He carried these scars as lessons, turning sorrow into resilience, showing us all that even when life steals what you love most, you can keep creating, keep giving, keep believing. That is why his absence feels unbearable tonight, not because he was untouchable, but because he was one of us, proving that greatness is not born of ease but of fire. So how do we honor Robert Redford now that the curtain has fallen? Not with cold headlines, but with remembrance, with gratitude, with stories whispered across generations. If his films touched your soul, if his courage moved you, if his journey left your heart heavier tonight, let it be known. Leave a prayer, share a memory, whisper a word of gratitude, not as routine, but as a gesture of respect for a man who gave everything he had and who in return gave us something far greater than stardom, the reminder that true greatness is not applause but endurance, not fame but humanity. May Robert Redford rest in eternal peace. His spirit carried forever in the stories he told, the voices he lifted, and the lives he quietly touched. The curtain has fallen, but his echo endures in every filmmaker he inspired, in every audience he moved, in every heart that refuses to surrender despite sorrow. Robert Redford lives on. His absence is vast, but his presence, through the legacy he built and the light he carried, will never fade.